Good morning. We're back with our live coverage here at the Law and Crime Network of the hearings for the judicial nominee for the Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Members of the American Bar Association are testifying, and let's continue to listen to what they're saying.
For both of them.
Well, that concludes the testimony of the ABA, the American Bar Association. The only question raised there at the end by Senator Whitehouse was whether there was a 90% win rate, Ron, for groups he called right-wing, and he suggested something else going on. What do you make of that?
I think that it's a great talking point for people who are critical of Kavanaugh to point to say, oh, he is in the pocket of these interest groups. But I think that there's more to it than that if you really look into it, because one, we don't know who these groups are. We don't know what these cases are. These could be cases where Kavanaugh, on his own, addresses certain types of laws a certain type of way, and he's consistent, and it just so happens to result in results that are in line with what these groups want. And when you look at a 90% plus win rate, to me that says that he's not always siding with these groups. So regardless of what these issues are, you can be consistent in your legal reasoning, and sometimes, it could be the vast majority of the time, you come out a certain way that is preferable to certain groups, and sometimes, occasionally, you don't.
Let's bring in former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi. Gene, let me ask you, if I can, what kind of cases is heard in the D.C. Circuit? This is a very powerful circuit.
That's an outstanding question. The D.C. Circuit is sort of the baby Supreme Court, very prestigious. And the cases that come up are usually regulation cases, agency cases, Administrative Procedures Act. But you get some fantastic cases. I think the Nixon tape case came from the D.C. Circuit, Pentagon Papers. I'm pretty sure on that one, too. And here's one that hasn't been brought up. And I'm not a big fan of Brett Kavanaugh, but I got to go back to my 20 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Virginia. Our office presented to a judge a search warrant of the congressional office of William Jefferson of Louisiana. And he went to trial, Congressman Jefferson, the one who had $90,000 in cash stored in his freezer. That was all he had to tell.
Jefferson, they call him, right.
Right, Brian. All you had to say in the opening was 90,000 in a freezer, and you could rest your opening.
Right.
But there was a search warrant issue, and Brett Kavanaugh was involved in that. And this gets into the whole nobody's above the law. I'm not 100% sure how it broke down, but I remember our office was very pleased that one of the jurists on the D.C. Circuit agreed with the prosecutor's view that a congressman's office is not protected by the speech and debate clause if they are committing a crime and using their office as a RICO enterprise.
Good point, Gene. We're going to continue with that. Let's get back now to the panel. The second panel's here. These are former law clerks, and there's Ted Olson, the former Solicitor General. A compelling narrative, highly critical of Judge Kavanaugh. Before that, we heard from one of his former law clerks who praised the judge. More testimony coming up in our live coverage of the hearings for Brett Kavanaugh on the Law and Crime Network. Please stay tuned. We're back now with our live coverage of the hearings for the nomination for Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. We're hearing now from Louisa Gary, a former friend from Yale, where he was an undergraduate, who also participated with him in a number of marathons. Let's listen to what she has to say. That's Elizabeth Weintraub, an advocacy specialist, and before that we heard from another person highly critical of Judge Kavanaugh, a border lawyer from Texas who suggested that her client was denied wrongly an abortion by Judge Kavanaugh until that ruling was overturned. Ron, how significant are these two witnesses?
I think that they are very significant, especially when you talk about the abortion case, because one thing that Judge Kavanaugh said a lot during his testimony was that when he looks at cases, he really looks at the real world implications and what's going on with the parties. And even if he doesn't And when he was talking about abortion, also in particular, he said that he tries to understand where people are coming from. Even though he's on the conservative side, he tries to appreciate what liberals have to say about it. But here we have a case where he ruled to impede a woman's attempt to get an abortion, and the argument here was that Kavanaugh was trying to delay it in order to push it past the 20-week limit so that the woman would not be able to legally get an abortion. So when you talk about real-world implications and trying to be sensitive, this testimony here really goes against that.
Gene Rossi, let me bring you in. These are two compelling personal stories we've heard that are critical of Judge Kavanaugh. Will it have any impact, you think, to the outcome of this hearing?
I agree with Ron on the first case. I couldn't hear the wonderful person on the second one when she was talking about the D.C. case. I did want to talk about that Garza opinion. I think her testimony is very important because as a current and former prosecutor, trial attorney, I can say this: timing's everything. That opinion, the Garza opinion, was in 2017. There is no doubt in my mind that Justice Kennedy probably had informed his former law clerk, Brett Kavanaugh, that Justice Kennedy, I'm thinking about retiring in 2018. Hey, you may want to get ready, get your resume and application ready for the Supreme Court. So what happened? Garza came before the D.C. Circuit, and Ron brought up an outstanding point. It goes to what I call the chiseling away at the abortion rights, constitutional rights. The whole issue in the transcript at the three-judge panel was, if you delay this too much, it's going to go into the 22nd, 23rd week. She won't be able to have an abortion that she was approved under Texas law. Not only did he rule against this undocumented person immigration case, but he wrote a scathing dissent. So I call this case a twofer. One, he's chiseling away at the right to choose. And two, he's sending a dog whistle signal to Trump that, hey, I'm going to be pretty hard on these undocumented persons. Even if they want to get an abortion, I'm going to make it hard for them. It was a twofer for him. And that scathing dissent to me was a dog whistle to Trump that I'm in your camp. That opinion really bothers me about Judge Kavanaugh.
In that he was preparing himself to be nominated. Others in legal circles say he's been working at this, preparing himself for at least 10 years.
Yes, and last year was a key moment because that's when they were starting to look at applicants, and the Federalist Society was just drooling to propose to Trump that it be Brett Kavanaugh.
Okay, Gene, we're going to continue with the nomination hearings for Brett Kavanaugh in just a moment here on the Law and Crime Network. We're back now with day 4 of the Senate hearings for Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Let's rejoin. We have the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Cedric Richmond, a congressman from Louisiana. Former Solicitor General Ted Olson testifying on behalf of Brett Kavanaugh. Ron, let me ask you, have we any indication, what we've seen so far, how Kavanaugh, as a justice of the Supreme Court, would rule if there are questions about a possible criminal indictment of President Trump or a subpoena for him to testify?
Well, first of all, we're not even sure that he would even weigh in on the matter. He could always recuse himself. That issue came up yesterday. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse brought it up, comparing it to a previous case from West Virginia where a judge was ruled to have to recuse himself because one of the litigants had donated millions of dollars to his campaign. And surely being appointed by a litigant could be viewed as having a disproportionate influence. Kavanaugh didn't really answer the question because it's typical for nominees not to weigh in on hypothetical future cases. But if he's talking to his Supreme Court colleagues about it and they convince him to recuse himself, he may not hear it at all. If he hears on it, if he does hear a case like this, I think that it would be to Trump's benefit because he has written about, he's talked about his leaning towards immunity and the president not having to deal with such matters while they're in office.
And is that an important question to be answered here, or we're not going to really get an answer?
I don't think we're going to get an answer. It would be nice to have one, but I don't think we're going to really get much progress there.
We're hearing from a panel of 10 witnesses, 5 presented by the Democrats, 5 by the Republicans, for and against Brett Kavanaugh as a nominee for the Supreme Court, and our live coverage will continue in just a moment. It's day 4 of the Senate hearings for Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. A number of witnesses for and against him. Currently testifying now, an Indiana housewife, Alicia Baker. She is saying that if Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed, it could mean an end to affordable birth control. Let's listen to what she has to say. A former clerk for Merrick Garland, who was nominated by President Obama, but the Senate never took it up. Ron, as we hear this, we've heard from both sides here. People praise his intellect, his integrity, and then there's criticism of some of his rulings. What impact do you think this has?
In the real world, I don't think a whole lot. Kavanaugh's beliefs are, pretty well documented. He doesn't hide the fact that he is a staunch conservative. The question is, will he act on those beliefs or set them aside? And that's really the main issue here. And all indications, all statements so far seem to be that he would be able to do that he has been able to do that. The ABA committee's recommendation that he's well qualified, was really important, I think. You had one of the committee members talk about the integrity that Kavanaugh has. And to me, that means that, he follows the law as he sees it. He doesn't try to be an activist judge. He doesn't try to push his own agenda. He rules the way that he sees it. He calls the balls and strikes without favoring one side or another. People who criticize him may not believe that, and they're going to vote one way, but they probably made their minds before this hearing even started.
Let's bring in former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi from Virginia. And Gene, from what you're seeing here, is there anything that conceivably stands in the way of confirmation?
No, it's done. It's done. And I got to say, Colleen Sisdak, I hope I pronounced her last name right, she's a tremendously powerful witness, a character reference for Judge Kavanaugh. She was a student at Harvard, a mentee, worked for Chief Judge Merrick Garland. She's a great witness. I got to respectfully, humbly disagree with Ron about one thing. Going back to that Garza case, I really am bothered by the timing of the case and how fervent he was in his dissent in the en banc opinion. I think he was playing a little politics there. Lindsey Graham said he's not a politician. I think Judge Kavanaugh was being a politician when he wrote that scathing dissent a year ago in Garza on the abortion issue. And it was a case involving abortion and undocumented persons. As I said before, it was a twofer. So I disagree humbly with Ron.
Do you see him as, in the future, an intellectual leader of the court?
Yes, I do. Going back to his days in the White House, and this is something I said 2 days ago to Jesse, he was the smartest person in the White House. He was a double Yale undergrad law school. Closest I came to Yale Law School is I drove through New Haven, all right? So he was the smartest guy in the room in the White House, and it is beyond belief that they did not consult him, a good friend and colleague of Karl Rove, his assistant, about the torture issue and other issues. So he is going to be an intellectual heavyweight. I think he could be in a category of Scalia with a better personality. Scalia was a little irascible. I think Brett Kavanaugh is a heck of a lot more collegial and polite. I do think he could be an intellectual powerhouse on the conservative side, but I don't necessarily agree with his opinions.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Ron. Our coverage of the Senate hearings for Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh will continue in just a moment.